Hey everyone, welcome back to the Worth Your Time podcast. I'm your host, Erica, and I'm really excited today to be talking with Nancy Pearcey, who is the author of the book, Love Thy Body, among other books as well. And this is, I was just so in love with this book for this particular time in the world that I knew I had to ask her on the podcast. I've heard her speak on other podcasts, and I know you're just going to love hearing from her today. So Nancy, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
So what I have to just start by asking you, what prompted the idea to write this book specifically?
Well, it's a long story. I had written an earlier book called Total Truth, and I wrote that because I wanted to try to understand why Christians had a hard time grasping the notion of a Christian worldview. Mm-hmm. And in the questions you sent me, you started with that. So maybe that's a good place to start.
Yeah.
I had co-authored a book with Chuck Colson called How Now Shall We Live? And what I found out is that as I went out and did public speaking on the book, it was hard for people to grasp the idea of worldview for Christians. And so I kind of went back to the drawing board and thought, why is this a difficult concept? And I realized, well, the main reason is because we have this really strong sacred secular split that we tend to live as though there's some things on one side of a line, called God and church and religious activities, and then on the other side of the line is our ordinary life, our work and our recreation, our home, our political ideas, and so on. And a lot of Christians don't know how to bring the two together, and so that's sometimes called the sacred secular split. And if you have the sacred secular split, you are going to think that Christianity belongs on one side of the line. Francis Schaeffer, who is a well-known apologist, used the metaphor of two stories in a building. So he said that, the upper story is the sacred and the lower story is the secular. So to use that language, when we talk about Christianity, we often put it in the upper story, where it's a matter of personal experience, what makes us feel better, what gives us a sense of comfort and purpose in life. But we don't really see it as something that applies to all of reality. We don't think of it as we think of it more as a spiritual technique and not as a view of all of reality. And of course, that's what world view means. It means a view of the entire world. And so what I discovered is that as I began researching other areas is that if your concept of truth has a split, it's going to apply everywhere. And so when I started researching the life issues, abortion, euthanasia, homosexuality, and so on, I discovered that there's a split there too. If and the most obvious one is abortion. And since we just, we're in the middle right now of the controversy over the Supreme Court and Roe v. Wade, it might be a good place to start. So in the question of abortion, it turns out that if you want to understand what the secular world is saying, which I think we should do as Christians, if you want to understand what the secular world is saying, you read secular bioethicists, and they use the same split, but apply it to the human being. What they basically say is, yes, the fetus is human. Really, professional bioethicists do not deny that life begins at conception. The evidence from DNA and science and genetics is just too strong to deny it. Just read any embryology textbook.
Yes.
But what they do, how do they support abortion then? Well, they say, well, the fetus is human, but it's not a person until sometime later, usually defined in terms of some kind of cognitive ability, mental awareness, self-consciousness, and so on. Well, if you can be human at one point, but not a person until sometime later, then clearly these are two different things. And so you can use that same two-story metaphor and say, well, in the lower story is what we know by science, right? That's the secular realm. So that's what we know by science. Biologically, physiologically, chromosomally, clearly the fetus is human. But then it doesn't become a person until sometime later. So personhood is something in the upper story where it talks about what we value and what moral status that we give to human life. And so in that arena, well, if it's separated from biology, it ends up being very subjective. Every bioethicist draws the line at a different place.
Right.
So you see the split between the body and the person is coming straight out of what secular bioethicists say. And it turns out, once I had discovered that, well, it's not, I should have said back up a little. So the sacred secular split is not only for Christians. It turns out secular people have it too. They call it the fact value split, where facts are in the lower story and values are in the upper story. And so it's a split in the concept of truth itself. And so that's when I began to research bioethical issues. I thought, oh my goodness, here it is. That's the same fact value split now applied to the human being. What we know by science versus what we how we value life. So the facts of science versus how we value life. And so that's kind of how I got into writing this book, is I wanted to help Christians understand what we're up against in the secular world. How are secular people dealing with this? Because you have to answer the questions people are actually asking.
Right.
So that was my goal.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I wrote in that question, that this really helped me sort of understand that when I'm having a conversation with a person with a secular worldview, it really is almost like we're speaking a different language. We're not, like you said, we're not asking the same questions. We don't have the same values. Like, we don't have the same goals. And so it kind of actually was helpful, because I realized, as I maybe disagreeing with someone online or something, that like, it's not like they have it's not like they're a bad person, so to speak, for what they believe, but they're just coming at it from such a different place that there's just no way that we're ever going to be able to see eye to eye. And I think that's a first thing to recognize, I think, in helping us not be so frustrated by some of these conversations.
Yeah, that's a good point. People believe what they're told. And if they've been raised with a certain worldview, that's what they're going to believe. So it's not out of any sort of evil motivations. It's because they've been raised that way and they haven't had any reason to question it. So what I do in Love Thy Body is I help them question it. It's like you say, it's not enough to say, well, I disagree with you because, and I believe X, Y, and Z, because they'll just say, well, that's good for you. I'm happy if that works for you. So to really approach secular people, we have to be able to show that their worldview has deficiencies on its own terms. We have to enter into their worldview and show why it doesn't work. And so the goal of Love Thy Body is to help non-Christians recognize their own worldview is very dehumanizing. It's basically it erodes the whole basis of human rights. If, say, sticking with the example of abortion, if you can say that the fetus is human, but it has no human rights, well, they've just destroyed the basis of human rights. Right. Because the whole notion of human rights is that these are not anything you have to earn. These are not given to you by your government, because then the government can take them away. Human rights is something you have just because you're a member of the human race. And the Declaration of Independence called them inalienable, meaning nobody can take them away. If you have them just because you're human, or the Declaration of Independence adds, given by their creator, given by something higher than the state, in other words, then human rights are something you have just because you're made in God's image and you're human. But what secular bioethicists are saying, this is the implicit logic, not that all secular people recognize this, you have to help them see it. But implicitly, what they're saying is being human is no longer enough for human rights. You have to earn the right to be treated as a person, to have moral status, to be legally protected by becoming a person, quote unquote, which means, after you've developed a certain level of cognitive functioning. So you see, what you have to say to secular people is, you've just destroyed the whole basis of human rights. Do you realize that? If being human is no longer enough for human rights, this is dramatically dehumanizing as a worldview. And so you have to sort of make an apologetic showing that their own worldview doesn't work and doesn't give them what they want. Of course, most secular people still want human rights. And we have to show them that to have what they want, they have to accept the Christian worldview.
Right. And you wrote in the book about because nobody likes it when anyone makes a comparison to Nazi Germany, right? Or to slavery. But that is an applicable comparison. Can you tell us why that is an applicable comparison?
Yeah, so every non-Christian worldview is reductionistic, and that means they reduce human beings in some way. And so they reduce the value and dignity of human life. So abortion reduces the dignity of human life, like I just explained. It says if you're human, by the way, what they're really saying is, if the fetus is human, they're saying, well, we're basically going to adopt a materialistic view that says it's really just a chunk of matter. It can be killed for any reason or no reason. It can be experimented with. It can be tinkered with genetically. It can be picked through for sellable body parts, as Planned Parenthood does, and then tossed out with the other medical waste. And that's exactly how medical journals describe the fetus after abortion. They call it medical waste. So abortion is radically dehumanizing. And so the reason it's similar in principle to, say, Nazism had also a principle by which it dehumanized people. Its principle was race, right? The Nazis claimed to be Aryan. And if you were the wrong race, if you were Gypsy or Jewish or Slavic, then you had no human rights. You could be herded off into boxcars, shipped off to concentration camps, and worked to death or put in the ovens. So it's the principle here is, if your worldview dehumanizes human life, it will lead to radically negative consequences. So that's the connection.
I didn't put this down, but this question does come to mind, which is, I've heard a lot of people lately comparing abortion to sacrificing children to Moloch, the god from the Old Testament, or the fake god from the Old Testament. And what are your thoughts on that comparison? Because it's a little more tidy, I guess, these days, how it's done, but it seems like it's similar in nature.
Yeah, it's so sad. Not only the Philistines, but also in Carthage, they practiced child sacrifice. And what's interesting, that even the Romans at that time thought it was a hideous practice. It wasn't just Bible, well, they weren't Christians back then, but it wasn't just the Old Testament people of God. It wasn't just the Jews who thought it was a bad thing. Many of the surrounding cultures also thought that the child sacrifice was horrendous, morally awful. So it's interesting because you can see in the literature by Romans at the time saying that was one of their complaints about the people of Carthage. The Philistines actually crossed the Mediterranean Sea and were the ones who colonized Carthage. So they brought their child sacrifice with them. Yeah, the similarity would be, of course, that the Old Testament worship of Moloch was a religion. And the religion said, if you want to favor the gods, if you want the gods to show favor to you, you have to sacrifice something to them. And the most cherished thing, the most precious thing you have is your child. And so I do think there's some similarities in that abortion has almost become a sacred right to some feminists. There were not long ago in the news, there were some religious progressive, Christian progressives saying, that abortion is a blessing and we thank God for abortion. So that's where it's most obvious, is when religious progressives literally treat abortion as a sacrament.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. So I am basically agreeing with you, in other words.
Yeah, I just, it really does seem sometimes, for those that don't have a real faith, that secularism is the religion in a way. It's having an abortion, hopefully, that, they hope leads to a better life, essentially. I mean, that's the argument, that you're going to be able to go to school, that you're going to be able to have enough money to, all of these things. So it makes sense. Now, I wanted to ask you about one of the things I loved in the book was your the part that you wrote about how Christianity was really the founder of child welfare. We hear a lot about, obviously, you hear people all the time think, oh, Christians don't do enough for these kids that they want to be born, right? But the reality is that most of that stuff is done by Christian organizations and churches outside of the government, and that before Christianity, child welfare didn't exist. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that is so interesting. There's one historian who's written a whole book on this, and it's very interesting. In Roman culture, of course, the early Christian church was born into ancient Roman Greco culture. And in that culture, children had very little value. They were seen as non-persons. It was common to beat them. Parents rarely raised their own kids if they had slaves at all, slaves and servants. They would hand over their children to the slaves to raise. And of course, fathers had the right to kill their children for any reason if they wanted to. The father back then basically had authority of life and death over his household, which meant his wife, his children, his servants, and so on. And children were even seen negatively because they were weak and irrational, and Roman culture valued strength and rationality. So they were seen, and until they got a little older, they were just not seen as very, like I said, they were not even seen as persons. And by the way, you didn't ask this, but coincidentally, this was also another reason that women had low value in Roman culture, because women obviously are more engaged with their children, and the fact that women were more emotionally connected to their children was seen as a sign of weakness on their part, because why would you value something that has so little value? That shows something wrong with you. So it was one of the reasons that women were also denigrated in Roman culture. So it was Christianity that first introduced the idea that that children have great value. Just read what Jesus says about them.
Right.
Once you know that, you have a much greater understanding of why when mothers brought their children to Jesus to bless them, the disciples wanted to shoo them away, because they were more influenced by that notion. Well, children, they have no value. Whereas when Jesus accepted the children, he was not only valuing the children, he was also respecting the mothers. And he was saying that the mother's love for their children is not something, as a sign of weakness or vulgarity. And that's how the historian puts it. He said, the fact that mothers were more engaged with their children is a sign of weakness and vulgarity on their part.
Yeah. Oh man, you gotta love Jesus, right? I mean, you love him.
Most people don't realize that he was not only being kind to children, he was being respectful of mothers. He was saying that mothers' love for their children is valuable. It's a sign of the image of God. That there's some things we learn best about God from mothers because they're made in His image. And that was just not part of the culture at all. And of course, Jesus had there's other verses like, anyone who causes these young people to stumble, it would be better for a millstone to be hung around his neck, and so on. And so these were all just astonishing for the first century. Even the disciples had trouble with this. It was, I think it was the 4th century, John Chrysostom, one of the church fathers, was still telling parents, you need to raise your own kids, because like I said, it was common to just slough off childcare to servants because, this wasn't important. John Chrysostom actually has a sermon where he says, parents, you need to raise your own children, because after all, it is the most important job you have. What's at stake is an eternal soul. And that's how he put it. What's at stake is an eternal soul. So this is really the most important thing you should do. And that was like 4th century. He was still arguing that parents should value their children. So it took a while, but you're right. It was Christianity that turned the culture around and started us treating children as precious and valuable persons.
That's so cool. Now, you have so many subjects that you cover in this book, so we can't get to everything, but there was one line that I wanted to touch on, which is, when it comes to, when we're talking about transgender stuff and homosexuality, you write that we should tell the truth with our bodies. And I would love to hear you explain, what does that mean and why does it matter?
Yeah, I said that. That particular line, I think, with homosexuality, again, it's the split. Well, I'll start with transgenderism because it's easier to see there. The split between the person and the body. We talked about that with abortion. Well, it turns out it applies to homosexuality and transgenderism too. Transgender activists argue explicitly that your body has nothing to do with your gender identity, that your body or your biological sex is not part of your authentic self, that your internal sense of self can actually contradict your body. When I write books, I try to read what the experts say, right? Because that's what filters down. And so I read a book, I think it's the first book written by a philosopher at Princeton University, defending transgenderism. And to my great surprise, this was supposed to be a defense, but this philosopher said that transgenderism involves disconnect, disjunction, self-alienation, and then literally said this: your physical body means nothing at all. It tells us nothing. I thought, this is a defense. In my book, this is showing what's wrong with transgenderism. Once again, it's dehumanizing because it says that your body is not valuable. It's not significant. It's irrelevant to who you are. And so what we say as Christians is, why accept such an extreme devaluation of the body? It's so interesting because in the past, Christians have been thought to have a low view of the body. Right? We care only about the spiritual realm. This realm, this physical realm is not important. One of my students put it this way: growing up in the church, I was always taught spirit good, body bad. So ironically, today, it is Christians who are arguing for the value and dignity and purpose of the body. So we're over against transgenderism. We're saying that you should value your body and you should take your identity from your body. I read an interview with a 14-year-old girl who had lived as a trans boy for 3 years, from age 11, and then had very young, and have then reclaimed her identity as a girl. And here's how she put it in this interview. She said, the turning point came when I realized it's not conversion therapy to learn to love your body. Mm-hmm. And this interview came out after my book was already published, but it would have been a great interview to quote in a book titled Love Thy Body. But what it means is even secular people are starting to see that the issue with transgenderism is your view of the body. Yeah. And so, in fact, you'll start to see secular websites now saying transgenderism represents body hatred. They're starting to use that phrase. It's body hatred. So, the secular world is catching up with my book. So, that's my argument in Love Thy Body, is that the secular world is dismissing the body, and that Christians should say, no, God created the body. God created the physical world. It has value and dignity because anything God creates, is intrinsically good and has value.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on, why do people feel that they need to change their gender? Like what is that thing that makes them think that they're going to be fulfilled by this shift?
Yeah, there's two answers to that, because there's two types of gender dysphoria. Today, the most common type of gender dysphoria is it's sometimes called rapid onset gender dysphoria, because it arrives, it shows up for the first time in adolescence or teen years, and usually it's a girl. It's a girl who felt perfectly comfortable being a girl when she was young. And as far as we can tell, an awful lot of it is social contagion. Social contagion is like one kid commits suicide and suddenly there's a rash of teen suicides. Well, one kid, says, oh, I'm really a boy and I'm going to be one girl says, I'm really a boy and I'm much happier. And they get on YouTube and they do TikTok videos saying, oh, I finally got my T in my testosterone and I'm so happy. Or they show their scarred chests, because they got their mastectomy. And they say, oh, I'm so happy and I'm so, this is wonderful. So there is an awful lot of that. And now, up until recently, it was mostly on the internet. Now it's school. More and more kids are coming home from school and saying, oh, a first grader came home from school and told her mom, this was in the news, so which is how I know the story. First grader comes home and says, my teacher tells me, just because you have boy parts doesn't mean you're a boy, and just because you have girl parts doesn't mean you're a girl. So, mommy, what am I? This literally said, mommy, please take me to the doctor so we can find out what I am. So even kids at that age, and it's coming down to kindergarten, it's coming down to preschool. Gender ideology now is being taught at a very young age. So to answer your question, one reason is that they're absolutely surrounded by it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also cool and sophisticated.
Right.
Nobody wants to be a boring old heterosexual anymore. If you want to be sophisticated and cool and rebellious and all that, there was there's a recent, there's a trend now towards detransitioning.
Yes. Yeah.
So there was a detransitioner who's been featured in a couple articles recently. She was on Tucker Carlson recently. Her name was Helena. And she said, I was unhappy, like many teenagers, I had a lot of depression and anxiety. And, from school, I was bad because I was white, but I couldn't change that. And I was bad because I was heterosexual. Well, I couldn't really change that. And I was bad, but the one thing I could change was my gender. She said,
Mm-hmm.
well, that's what first made me think of it. Well, maybe I'd be better off if I changed my gender. And then, of course, once she started thinking about it, she started thinking, well, maybe some of my anxiety and depression and other issues are related to this. And so she lived as transgender for, I forget, for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. And then her name is Helena, if you want. I don't remember her last name, but mm-hmm. she's been in the news recently. But I would say, so that's actually, it seems to be the majority of the cases now. Now, there is true gender dysphoria.
Right, yeah.
Which usually starts at a very young age. Mm-hmm. So you may remember in my book, I do tell the story of a young boy named Brandon who had gender dysphoria from a very young age.
Yeah.
While he was still crawling, before he was even walking, people were starting to wonder what was up with this kid. He was his babysitter told his mother he's too good to be a boy.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, he was quiet, sweet, compliant, gentle, and so on. So anyway, I'll finish his story. In preschool, he was always playing with the little girls, not the little boys. By elementary school, he was coming to his parents weeping frequently and saying, I don't fit I don't fit in anywhere. I don't like the things boys like. I like the things girls like, feelings and emotions and relationships. God should have made me a girl. And by his teenage years, by 14, he was scouring the internet for sex reassignment surgery. And he said, well, what did his parents do? First, they made sure he knew they loved him just the way he was. They didn't try to change him. I had a friend in seminary who was a former homosexual. And he said, when I was young, I liked art and music. And my dad was baffled and kept trying to toughen me up by pushing me into more masculine activities like sports. And Brandon's parents didn't do that. They said it's perfectly okay to be a gentle, sensitive, emotional boy. It does not mean you're really a girl. Mm-hmm. It may mean that God has equipped you to be in the caring professions, like a counselor, psychologist, healthcare worker. And they took him through the Myers-Briggs types and showed him that boys and girls can be at either end of the spectrum. And they took him through the fruits of the Spirit and the gifts of the Spirit. Prophecy and teaching are not masculine, as we might expect. Mercy and service are not feminine. So it took a long time. I mean, gender dysphoria is truly a difficult thing. But by his early 20s, he had pretty much reconciled himself that he was a boy. Here's how he put it. I came to realize that surgery would not give me what I wanted. It would not make me a girl. There's a very famous TED talk by a cardiologist, and the most famous line from it is every cell has a sex.
Yeah, I've seen that somewhere. Well, like what you're saying, what he learned, what his parents taught him, like that's what we should be telling kids. We should be telling kids it's okay to be sensitive. It's okay to like dolls. It's okay to want to play with girls. Like it's okay to be who you are. Like that seems like it would be a much more affirming and healthy way to talk with kids about this stuff. Like it becomes they've made it so stereotypically gender-based again. It doesn't even make sense. It's like, what? Now you're saying that like to be a girl, you're supposed to wear pink, that all of that is coming back up and it doesn't make sense. That kind of leads me to my next question too, which is, one of the things that we hear from the left constantly is, I believe in science. Like I see this all the time. I see this in my mom's groups on Facebook where they'll be like, somebody said, I'm looking for a church that believes in science. This kind of thing. And I'm like, first of all, Christians believe in science. That's just a silly myth. But secondly, when it comes to science, they don't believe all science. Like you said, like they're not believing that people are people. As science says, they're not believing in actual biology. As we're born, we're not assigned a sex at birth, as they say. We are a particular sex at birth. And so I guess my question is, how does a secular worldview, how does that encourage this kind of weird, irrational thinking?
Yeah, I agree with you. It is an internal contradiction because the whole theme of Love Thy Body, my book, is that all of these moral issues, that the secular worldview dismisses science, it dismisses the body, whether it's abortion, like I said, read any embryology textbook. The fetus is clearly human. And so the secular worldview has to somehow dismiss that. Or transgenderism, clearly your biology, you're biologically male or female. Of course, people will always say, well, what about intersex? And so you always have to answer that question. Intersex people are not trans. That's the first thing. Most people think it's trans. No. Trans people are biologically line up with their sex. Their gonads, their genitals, their gender, all line up. They're either male or female. So it's not a physical thing, it's a psychological thing. Intersex is truly a physical thing. Yeah. And that is that they really do have some abnormality, or they're atypical in their physical qualities. Their hormones, their chromosomes are different, and leading to sometimes their physical anatomy being somewhat indecipherable. It's not always quite clear whether they're a boy or a girl. So that I've talked to a couple of intersex people, which has been cool. Because they come up and talk to me after I give my lecture, and so yeah. If they're in my audience, they'll come and talk to me. So I've met several intersex people now, and most of them are fine. Like they know that most intersex people are either male with a few anomalies or they're female with a few anomalies. Mm-hmm. And they're only less than 1% of the population anyway. Secular people like to try to use them as a political football by saying, oh, there's not just male and female, there's all these things in between, which we call intersex. Well, they're less than 1% of the population. So mathematically, they can't be a whole spectrum in between.
Right. And I heard somewhere, maybe you've heard this, that they don't like that. They don't like being used in that way. I heard on their website that they're like, by the way, we're not part of this whole thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So one of the intersex women who contacted me. By the way, on the spectrum thing, there are only two gonads, right? There's sperm and egg. There's nothing in between.
Right.
You either have sperm or egg. That's it.
Right.
But yeah, one of the intersex women who contacted me, she was one of the very, very few where the doctors weren't sure. And so they decided to. Do you know where the term "sex assigned at birth" comes from? Comes from intersex.
No, I didn't know that.
That's where it came from originally, because there are.
It doesn't even work at all. Then.
that's the origin of it was that in a very, very few cases, doctors are not quite sure. Well, of course, this was before they did chromosome testing too. So this friend of mine, her name is Leanne. They did do chromosome testing, and from her physical anatomy, they decided she was maybe more masculine than feminine. So they raised her as a boy, but she was always very small, very petite. She always felt feminine. She had a scholarship at college, and they basically said, you need to get into counseling or we're going to take away your scholarship, because her gender issues were so obvious. I mean, when a boy's walking around with a skirt, they say, today, that would be okay. Yeah. Yeah. But back then they said, you need to get into counseling. Anyway, she finally, as an adult, had the chromosome test and found out that she had a very rare form of Turner syndrome. And there's an intersex condition called Turner syndrome. it was XXXO.
Hmm.
And so she decided to resolve the ambiguity in favor of feminine instead of masculine. So
Yeah.
and that's what all of the surgeries and hormones that they use for on transgender kids was originally devised for intersex people, because she then went ahead and got the female hormones that her body wasn't producing, went through puberty in a matter of months, which was tough, and got the surgery,
Mm-hmm.
and lives as a woman and is married.
Wow.
So for intersex people, that's where many of these things were, the surgeries and hormones first came up with, to help them, because their chromosomes truly are somewhat anomalous. And so it helps resolve, sometimes they need some help resolving the identity in terms of female and male. But anyway, so that's, I remember why I brought that up, because she said to me, when you said they don't like, intersex people don't like being pushed, let me see if I can remember her exact words. I quoted her in Love Thy Body. She said something like, it hurts to be pushed into either camp.
Mm-hmm.
That intersex people don't want to be a political football.
Right.
And they don't want to be pushed into either camp, not the LGBT camp. But what's happened with her is because she didn't figure out her true identity until she was an adult. Even some Christian churches have kicked her out. They've said, "Oh, so you're really trans? That's what you're saying?" No, intersex.
Yeah, that's.
So she's actually been kicked out sometimes by Christian groups. Yeah, so Christian groups need to educate themselves on what is intersex, and of course they should be treated with love and acceptance just like anyone else with genetic issues, with physical differences. But it's not just Christians. She went to a doctor once. He looked at her medical history and said, "Oh, so you're really a boy." No. So it's something we need to educate ourselves on, because secular people use it to argue against the male-female binary, but some intersex people are not even accepted by Christian groups, and so we need to educate ourselves.
Yeah, that makes me sad to hear that, because anytime I hear of any church or Christian group kicking someone out, or however you would say it, for a reason like that, I mean, it just makes me want to cry and yell and be like, that's not how we all are, but okay, I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted to, this is on the questions that I sent you, but I'll just read it to you, a quote from your book that says, this is from someone else that you were quoting, but I thought it was really interesting. So once you basically redefine humanity as sexless, you end up with a dehumanized society in which there can be no legal mother or father or son or daughter or husband or wife without permission from the state. And then following that, you write, we speak ourselves into existence. Language takes priority over biology. Could you speak a little further on how language shapes people and shapes society?
Yeah, again, the most obvious is transgenderism, because basically the person is saying, no, what I call myself is what counts, not my biology, not my body, not my chromosomes, not my physiology, not my anatomy, nothing physical. The only thing that counts is what I call myself. And by the way, one researcher found that, so this was Lisa Diamond. She's the one who actually promoted the idea of fluidity. You know how you hear sex is fluid. Mm-hmm. She's the one who came up with that term. And the reason she did is that when she discovered that 80% of people who come out as homosexual change their sexual identity label at least once. 80%, at least once. That means for some people it's more. So in other words, they come out as homosexual and then later decide they go back to heterosexual, or they go to bisexual or queer or some other label. But the point is, first of all, it does not sound like a trait that is biologically determined. So what it comes down to is what I call myself. And that's why it's become such a big deal about pronouns. What I call myself is who I am. Therefore, you better use my pronouns, because that's my identity. That's my core identity. So language, therefore, is now taking precedence over biology. What I call myself is what counts. And that's what counts in the law, too. The context of that quote was the law. So for example, the only way the law can treat a trans woman, which is somebody born male, the same as a biological woman, is to say that biology doesn't matter in terms of the law. That the law will only recognize gender, not sex, gender being whatever you call yourself. And so in the Bostock decision, which was 2020, the Supreme Court said that. It said, yes, the law will only recognize what you call yourself and not your sex. And I think it was for the purposes of Title VII, but of course it was quickly applied elsewhere as well. So the law itself now does not recognize your sex. The law recognizes only what you call yourself. And it's the same thing for homosexuality. So the meaning of the Obergefell decision, which legalized same-sex marriage, was the same thing. Up until then, marriage was thought to be rooted in biology. Right? The males and females naturally come together and form families. But what the Supreme Court said was, no, biology doesn't matter. All that matters is your emotional commitment. Well, we have lots of emotional commitments, so what does that mean? That means the state decides which emotional commitments it's going to call marriage. So essentially, marriage is no longer rooted in biology. It's rooted in, whoever calls themselves married.
Right.
Again, it's language. Language determines whether you're married or not your biology, not your biological relationship. Or same thing with abortion. If the fetus is human, but that being human does not warrant legal protection. It doesn't get legal protection until it becomes a person. Well, who decides if it's a person? The state. I mean, ultimately it's the state.
Yeah. Well, that reminds
whoever has the most power. So again, it's who's going to call this a person? It's language.
Yeah. That reminds me of, and maybe you've heard this term too, of the term linguistic theft. Have you heard that term?
Linguistic what?
Linguistic theft. So
theft.
I heard that from Natasha Crane. She wrote the book Faithfully Different that recently came out. And she just talks about how the secular culture will take a word that, maybe we all support, and then they sort of change the definition so that if you don't support it, then you sound like a bad person, like equality. If you don't support the word, if you don't support equality, which who knows what that is, it's however the secular world is defining it currently, then you therefore now are not a good person. And so it's just another example of how language can be used to shape so much in a very negative way. So, yeah.
Let me give you a final example, because the quote that you read included parenthood. Up until recently, parenthood was thought to be rooted in biology. Like the woman who carried the child was the mother,
right?
And the legal father was her legal husband. He was presumed to be the father. That was called the presumption of parentage. But in a same-sex couple, at least one person is not genetically related to the child. And so until recently, the non-genetic person, did not go on the birth certificate because, it's supposed to be genetic relationship. Well, same-sex couples could adopt, but they didn't want to do that because then they would be being treated differently from opposite sex couples, and they wanted to be treated exactly the same, otherwise it was discrimination. So in a 2017 decision, the Supreme Court agreed. It said that as long as the couple is legally married, it's a same-sex marriage, then the non-biological parent does go on the birth certificate and is given the same status as a biological parent. So notice once again, parenthood is now being defined apart from biology.
Oh, in so many other ways as well. Surrogacy and
yes.
That's a whole other can of worms we could get into.
Well, for many same-sex couples, they're using various forms of artificial reproduction. But the main point in all of those is that somebody who's not genetically related is going to be treated as if they were genetically related. So what that comes down to then is parenthood is not based on biology, it's based on whoever the state calls the parent. So again, that's why that quote ended with, you are your child's parent by the permission of the state. That was the reasoning behind that.
Yeah. All right, Nancy, I know we're out of time, but last question just would be, how would you encourage people that want to, I mean, outside of reading Love Thy Body, of course, any other materials or people they should be listening to, just as we're like navigating this tumultuous world of secular culture?
Well, it is interesting that since my book Love Thy Body came out, there have been a couple other books on the body.
Yeah.
People have said, we need to change our way of treating the body. And so there's that one, I haven't read it yet, but it just came out called, I think, a Protestant theology of the body, because there was a Catholic theology of the body. And there's a book called Embodied. And, there are people are starting to, yeah. Okay. So people are starting to recognize, hey, if we want to counter the secular world on these moral issues, it turns out that they all have to do with how we treat the body. And Christians need to really rethink that sacred secular split and come to a broader Christian worldview that says, no, all of creation is a product of God. It's all God's handiwork, and therefore it all has value and purpose and dignity. And I suppose one other possible way to think about it is really what's at the heart of the question about evolution, by the way. There's a very outspoken lesbian whose name is Camille Paglia. You might know her.
Yes, I've heard of her, yes.
Right. A lot of Christians read her because she's a bit of an iconoclastic feminist. Because she says she does not accept the feminist idea that sex is just a social construction. She says, no. Nature, here's how she puts it: nature made us male and female. Oh wait, let me see if I can remember her exact words were kind of funny. She said, humans were designed for sexual reproduction. Humans were designed for sexual reproduction. So you say, well, then how do you justify being a lesbian? And by the way, she's recently decided she's trans. She's come out as trans. But either way, if nature made us male and female, how do you justify that? And here's what she says. She says, well, why not defy nature? After all, and this is a direct quote, she says, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. So do you see the logic? The logic is that if our bodies are products of blind, material, purposeless forces, then they have no intrinsic purpose that we are morally obligated to respect. They give us no moral message. They give us no clue to our identity. And we can treat it like some sort of a tool that we can use however we want. So the answer to that is Christians really need to practice explaining to secular people that this world does have a purpose, that God did create it for a purpose. And even science shows us, I mean, at a very rudimentary level, eyes are made for seeing, ears are made for hearing, wings are made for flying.
Like, how much more obvious could the body be? It couldn't be any more obvious, right?
I mean, biologists deal with this all the time. They call it teleology. Teleology is just a technical word being made for a purpose.
Right.
And so Christianity explains why we see teleology in nature, and especially, by the way, with the discovery of DNA, because what that means is the whole development of the organism is directed by an inbuilt plan or blueprint.
Yeah.
So even science shows that nature was made for a plan, a design, a purpose, a plan. And so what Christians are saying is that when we live in accord with that plan, we're going to be happier and healthier. I'll give you one story. We didn't do too many stories, so I'll give you just one from my book. It's a short one, but it illustrates this point. So I give the story of Jean, who was a lesbian, lived as a lesbian for many years, and today is a Christian, married, and has 2 kids. And here's how she put it. She said, this is a direct quote, I came to trust that God had made me female for a reason. And I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. And so that is the theme I press home again and again in Love Thy Body, is we need to learn to use that positive language. And by the way, Erica, I have found that this is a difficult thing. When I speak to Christian audiences, they find this really hard. They're so used to saying, it's wrong, it's a sin, it's against the Bible, don't do it. And the implication, of course, is there's something wrong with you. So we're very much known for that negative message. Mm-hmm. And so when I speak on this in public, to Christian audiences, I come back to this over and over again. Jean said I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. And so honor your body, live in harmony with your body, respect the Creator's design, live in accord with who God created you. We need to practice using this positive language. There's another story that came out after the book. It was a woman who had lived as a trans man. She had passed as a man for 10 years. And then converted to Christianity. And she said, at first, sanctification takes a while. So at first she thought she could continue living as a man. And she said, I aspired to be a real man of God. And then one day, while she was praying, she seemed to hear God say to her, you cannot claim to love me and yet reject my creation. And she knew what that meant. It meant reject her body, that she was female. That was his creation. That's how God had made her. So that's another example. It's not.
I've heard that woman on a podcast.
Have you heard her?
Her story is amazing. I mean, it's amazing.
Yes. Well, this was early on. I think she had just been interviewed for Christian Post. So I contacted her and got her story. But now, she's written a book now.
Yeah.
So I'm glad she's getting better now. But the point is, if there's one positive practical strategy that we all need to practice, it is learning to convey the Christian message in this positive way. That the reason that we're standing for the Christian view on all of these issues is because we have a high view of the body, and we want to convey that we're encouraging you to love your body, to respect your body, to live in harmony with your biological sex. Mm-hmm. Or as you put it earlier, to tell the truth with your body. Mm-hmm. That this is how you were created. You were created. And that comes, I can't resist one more story.
Go ahead.
Stories are so good.
Yes, they are.
They drive it home. So one of my favorite stories in Love Thy Body is a man named Sean Doherty, who was exclusively homosexual. By the way, you have to say that these days, because if you later leave homosexuality, they will say, oh, well, you never were really exclusively homosexual. You were probably bi. So he makes the point that he was exclusively homosexual. And what's interesting about his story is that, and I did not say this in the book, and I should have, because this gives it a little more pizzazz. He was raised in a gay-affirming family and attended a gay-affirming church. And so his change was not driven at all by guilt or shame, which is the assumption, right?
Right.
Guilt, shame, and self-loathing is usually the assumption, and it wasn't. He was a person who sincerely and truly just started saying, I want to take my identity from my body. Instead of trying to change my feelings, which rarely works, I'm going to take my identity from what I already have, which is a male body, and to treat it as a good gift from God. That's how he put it, as a good gift from God. And eventually my feelings started to follow suit. And so that really is the worldview point at the core of this debate. Do we live in a cosmos created by impersonal, blind, material, purposeless forces? Or do we live in a cosmos created by a loving creator, which is therefore intrinsically good? So that's the message we need to convey to people.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you don't have to ask the question, should I or shouldn't I be this other gender? Because you can just take it from there and then build who you are out from that body, from that foundation that God has given you. That's so true. All right, Nancy. Well, thank you so much for all of your time. It's been awesome just hearing your insights on these things. I think they're so important. I think there's a lot of confusion. I think there's a lot of, like you said, confusions among Christians. Like, fully understanding even why our faith directs us in this way, which is why I thought your book was so helpful, because it really articulates and lays out things in a way that are understandable and that honestly really reinforce your beliefs in a biblical Christian worldview in a powerful way, that you feel more confident speaking out about these things. Because I know for me, it has been a little bit difficult to initially kind of, let myself out as a biblically, I'm viewing things that way in this culture. But in the past year or so, I've really come to understand more why I believe what I believe in terms of these things. And I've been more confident and said, look, like, you can call me names, you can call me whatever you want, but I believe what I believe, and I'm not ashamed of that. So thank you so much for your courage in putting this book out.
Yeah, it helps if we have, like I said, a positive message, because one reason we get shut down is because everyone assumes that we have a negative message. And so if we can shift that debate and show people that, no, Christianity has a higher view of the physical world than any other religion or philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
People sometimes say, oh, well, the materialist or the secularist has a higher view of the body, because after all, they think the material world is all that exists. But just because you think it's all that exists does not mean you think it has high value. I mean, like that Camille Paglia quote where she said, well, why should I pay attention to my body? Because the body is just a product of blind material forces. So why should I respect my body? Why should I take my identity from my body? So it is actually a secular worldview that has a very dehumanizing, low view of the body. And so once we really capture that, we will be so much more confident in being able to say, wow, Christianity is wonderful. It teaches this very high view of the body. We should be so overjoyed, in conveying it, bringing it out into the public, and because it's such a positive message, that we should be excited and happy to convey it.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And I just appreciate your time. And hopefully someday you'll be speaking near somewhere I am, so I can come say hello.
Well, it was great to talk with you. Yeah, you're a wonderful host.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Okay, you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.